23. Mark 13:14, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one who is on the housetop must not go down, or go in to get anything out of the house. And the one who is in the field must not turn back to get his coat, but woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that it may not happen in the winter. For those days will be a time of tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the creation, which God created until now, and never will. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect whom He chose, He shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, He is there, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. I'll bring you back to chapter 13, and we'll look at just verses 14 through 23. And there are some things that I wanted to talk about this morning as we come into this section, a little bit about prophecy, but before we do, I was thinking about a conference I was at not too long ago, and the guy who was speaking, and I won't say what the conference was, but he was talking about an over-realized eschatology. And we understand what eschatology is. If you don't, I'll explain it to you. Eschatology is basically the doctrine of last things. It comes from the Greek word eschatos, which means last. So therefore, it is the doctrine of last things. And when we talk about eschatological living, it's living a life that is focused on the last things or looking to the future. It is a heavenly directed life. But he was talking about an over-realized eschatology, and I understood his concern because he was dealing with an issue similar that we find in Thessalonians. His concern was that people in the church were not actively doing the gospel ministry, in the sense that they were just sort of sitting around doing nothing. And Paul had that problem in Thessalonica. There were those who were anticipating the Lord's return to the point that they were not working, they were not caring for themselves, they were sitting around just sponging off others and not doing what they needed to be doing and working. And so I understood the brother's concern, but the more that I thought about it, I thought the problem of the American church is not an over-realized eschatology, it is an under-realized eschatology. It is the fact that we do not realize that we are in the last days. I take you, if you will, turn your Bibles with me to 2 Timothy. We will come back to Mark, but 2 Timothy chapter 3. We've been there before, but I take you back there again. And then we're going to jump to 1 John. And I normally don't do stuff like this, but I'm going to do it this morning. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, he says, but realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come, perilous times. The term that he uses here describes demoniacs in the Gospel of Matthew. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. And Paul says, avoid such men as these. In other words, they put on a pretense of being believers, and yet at the same time, they are not truly. What's interesting about this list that Paul lays out here for us is that he starts off in the future and he's presenting it as this is something that is going to come down the line, but then he automatically then moves, as he moves through here, he moves to the present tense. In other words, Timothy is already dealing with these kinds of things. He's already to avoid these kind of people. They are already manifesting themselves. In other words, that Timothy was in the last days. Okay? So if Timothy was in the last days, then where are we? We're in the last days, right? Go with me to 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. John writes this To the churches in Asia Minor, he says in verse 18 of chapter 2, "Children, it is the last hour. And just as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming even now, many Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it is the last hour." The problem with the American church is not an over-realized eschatology, it is an under-realized eschatology. The fact that we do not realize that we are in the last days, it is, as John says, the last hour. If you can take the analogy, what if you went into the doctors and the doctor said to you, you have 3 months to live? What would that do? That would radically change your life, wouldn't it? If you knew that in 3 months you were going to die and you had 3 months left to live, that would change your perspective. You would get a sense of clarity, right? And you would start to reevaluate your life. Now, they might take one route, and if they know that they have 3 months to live, they may look at their bucket list and say, these are all the things that I want to experience before I go from this earth. And that route would be a very selfish, self-serving route, because it would be all these experiences that you would want to have in this life before you're gone from this earth, and it really doesn't matter if anyone partakes in it, but you want to fulfill these experiences, eat these foods, whatever it is, you want to do this before you go. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. That's one approach. The other is that you would start to get your life in order. You would start to evaluate the things in your life and say, these things are important, these things are not important. You would start to put aside the peripherals, focus on the things that were crucial, and you would also start to focus more attention on the people in your life that really mattered, and you would spend time trying to pour into their life. In other words, as you receive clarity about life, that life is short and you never know when you're going to go, but in your case you know, that you would start to clarify your life, and you would start to pour your life into other people, and you would help them clarify their life. And you would sit down and you would give them words of wisdom and principles that would guide them, because you're no longer going to be here. Much like Paul did to Timothy in 2 Timothy. I'm going to go. I know my life is being poured out as a drink offering, and these are the last words that I could share with you before I go. See, if we knew that it was the end, our life would be different. We would be more clarified in how we are supposed to live our life. The problem is that we really don't live as though the Lord is going to come again, or at least not immediate. And we really think that we have a long time before He's actually going to come. But the reality of it is, we don't know the hour or the day. We don't know when these things are going to happen. We know that things will escalate, right? But everything is according to God's calendar. But we do know that it is coming. So I take you back to Mark chapter 13, because as we started to look at this chapter, we saw that Jesus started to pour forth teaching, and it was very practical. The whole section is bracketed by challenges to how you are to live your life. And throughout it, we saw that there's 19 imperatives that run through here and challenging us on how we are to live. And we are to challenge to beware, challenge to be focused, challenge to be awake, to be attentive to what is happening. In chapter 13, verse 10, we know what the task is. It is the gospel must be preached to all the nations. That's what we do until the Lord comes. The issue for us, I am afraid, is that we think that we have tons and tons of time. We live as though we actually know when the Lord is going to come, and we don't. And we think that we have all the time in the world to get down to the Lord's business, but we really don't. And so I take you back to chapter 13, because now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the eschatological perspective that Christ gives us here. And as He begins to develop for us this thought of the tribulation, we're going to find that it's not going to be a pretty experience. But before we come into this passage, I want to talk a little bit about prophecy, because I think it's interesting. Oftentimes we don't understand the principles that are involved with dealing with prophetic literature, especially when we come to passages like this. And so a couple principles I wanted to lay out for you. One of them I think is interesting is the principle of foreshortening. And I take this quote from Zook in his book on hermeneutics, which if you don't have that book on your shelf, you must have it on your shelf. Everyone should have that copy. But he says this, looking ahead, the prophets often envisioned the two advents of Christ as two mountain peaks with a valley in between. They could see the peaks, but not the valleys. From our perspective, however, as we look back, we see the time gap between the first and second advents. Often the Old Testament blends the two comings of Christ into one passage. An example is Isaiah 61, 1 through 2. And we know that Christ, when he was in Nazareth, he read from this passage and he quoted from it, and he went as far as to quote all the way to the first part of verse 2, but he did not finish the rest. He ends with to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, but he leaves out this last part, and the day of vengeance of our God, which obviously refers to the Lord's return when he will take vengeance out on his enemies. In other words, there are two different events that are happening here. And that's all just in a period of just one verse. Seeing events related to two advents of Christ together, the Old Testament prophets often did not understand how it would unfold. We assume that they understood and got everything, but they didn't. There was much that they didn't understand. And so it's very intriguing as you walk back through and you look at the disciples' question to Jesus Christ. They obviously, when he started to talk about these events, they saw a whole bunch of things were supposed to be happening at the same time. And obviously they had this singular perspective in their mind that all these things would happen at the same moment and there wouldn't be this time gap. And Jesus is showing them there is going to be this interval. Their problem was that they couldn't see the interval. Our problem is we see too much of an interval. The other principle is this, the partial final fulfillment. If you turn to Acts, and you don't need to do it now, but sometime in reading, turn to Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. Peter is going to quote from the book of Joel. And he is going to reflect on there is a partial fulfillment of Joel on the day of Pentecost. But there is much that Peter quotes of that didn't take place on the day of Pentecost yet to be fulfilled in the future, I believe. There are also events that foreshadow what is going to come in the tribulation and in the end times. And we find that when we come to chapter 13, because Jesus, as he began to interact with the disciples and he departs from the temple, he begins to instruct them and he warns them because of the perils that's going to come in regards to the temple, that everything is going to be laid waste. There is a fulfillment of that comes in AD 70, but there is still a future fulfillment that is going to come in regards to the temple and the desecration of it. And I would suggest to you that they are not the exact same event, but yet the one foreshadows what is going to come into the future. So we already began to look at the warning about the perils from the character of the age, chapter 13, verses 5 through 8, and then warning about personal danger amid persecution, 13, 9 through 13. We saw opposition through official channels, opposition through close personal relationships, opposition in regards to all kinds of people, and then through it all is the challenge to endure unto the end. Chapter 13, verse 13. You have been hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. That leads us to this next section I want to look at this morning, and that is chapter 13, verses 14 through 23, the portrayal of the coming crisis. Now, it's interesting because the next two major sections, they form the heart of the Olivet Discourse. And if we break them up, there are two aspects that are being dealt with here. The first is the unparalleled tribulation, which offers appropriate guidance that Jesus is going to teach his disciples as to how to respond, not just to the immediate disciples, but also to those who are going to go through this period. Those who are going to be saved and come to Christ during this time. They're going to be present, and therefore Jesus is going to give instructions in regards to that. And then the second section, starting in verse 24, pictures the return of the Son of Man in all of his glory with his angels. This forms the heart of this Olivet Discourse. And when we get to chapter 13, verse 14, we're going to start talking about the tribulation. And I typically won't do this of sort of imposing my thought a little bit out there, but I'm going to do that here. I do not believe that the Olivet Discourse is dealing with the rapture in any way. I do not think that it is present in this text, and I'll give you a reason why I don't think so. But so when he talks about the tribulation and so on, nowhere in here is he going to focus on the rapture of the church. Pre or post, however you take it, I don't think he's dealing with it here. And we'll come to chapter 13 as he talks about sending out his angels in verse 27 and so on, and we'll talk about the implications of that. But again, I don't think that that is dealing with the issue of the rapture. So I think that it is absent in this context. In my personal belief, I believe that it is a pre-tribulational. That is what I believe, but I do not think that he is dealing with here, and I'll give you my reasons why. The main reason is this, that in chapter 13, verses 14 through 23, Jesus is going to describe this end-time crisis, and it is the sign the disciples had asked for. They were enthusiastically looking to Christ issuing or bringing in his kingdom, his earthly kingdom. They were expecting it to come immediately. This is what they were expecting when they were entering into Jerusalem. They're expecting this political reign upon the earth, the overcome of Rome, that they are going to have their king upon the throne from the Davidic line. And this is what they're expecting, is this establishment of the kingdom. Their views of the future essentially were Jewish. And everything that they thought about, the anticipation, the kingdom, and all of that had to do with the nation of Israel. In other words, they were not thinking about the coming of the church yet. There was still much that they did not understand in regards to the church. And as we walked through Mark, we saw they even had trouble understanding the Messiah's role, and that he was going to be a suffering Messiah. There were many concepts that they still did not grasp. And so therefore, if Jesus had spoken to them about the rapture in the future, he would only have added to their confusion and their limited understanding of the things that he's already said to them. And so I do not believe that he is dealing with the rapture of the church in this passage. The two main things that he's going to deal with is he's going to deal with the tribulation, and then he's going to deal with the second coming. And those other elements he leaves out. And if we want to find out where we stand on the rapture, we're going to have to go to some other book, I believe. So I bring you to chapter 13, verses 14 through 23, the portrayal of the coming crisis. Now it's interesting that as we come into this section, there are many interpreters who limit these events that are laid out here as being the chaotic years before the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in AD 70 under Titus. And although the conquest is dealt with of Jerusalem, we saw this earlier part in chapter 13 when the disciple looks upon the wonderful stones and the wonderful buildings of the temple, and Jesus says to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will be torn down." This is looking forward to AD 70 when Titus is going to destroy the temple and all of Jerusalem. And there is that foreshadowing of what's going to come in the future. But I just say to you, do not allow that to cloud as we come into this passage, because what Paul is talking, or what Christ is talking about here in verses 14 to 23, he is not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. He is talking about the Great Tribulation. And we'll see the reason for this as we walk through this text. The things that Jesus describes that is going to take place, there is no way that that refers to what happened in AD 70. Can only refer to the Great Tribulation, or as Revelation puts it, the tribulation, the great one, that is going to come in future times. What starts us off for us in chapter 13, verse 14 is a reference to the abomination of desolation. This is the link from the links the historical to the eschatological prophecies that are found in Daniel in chapter 11, verse 31, 9, 27, and 12, 11. And Jesus links that with that by this statement. So in other words, the near tribulations foreshadow the far tribulation of the end time. So the things that he talks about earlier on in this chapter in regards to the war and the nations going against nation and the earthquakes and all of those things, these are all things that are going to lead up to, build upon, until we finally get to that final tribulation. As Jesus says in chapter 13, verse 8, these are the beginnings, these are the birth pangs. And just as in childbirth, as the pain gets worse and worse, the closer you get to the giving birth of the child, so are the days, so are these calamities, so are the wars. But finally, eventually, they are going to lead into the Great Tribulation, which eventually then is going to lead in to the birth of the new age, which is the coming of the Messianic reign upon the earth and his kingdom of peace and righteousness that will come with that. So we see this escalation of times and the events that are going to take place. And this morning, all we're going to focus on is chapter 13, verses 14 through 23. Let's look at the crisis. And as this unfolds, you will begin to see that what Jesus is talking about here cannot be the crisis that happened in AD 70 under the hand of Titus and the destruction of Jerusalem. That this must be looking forward to something far greater, far worse, like nothing that's ever been seen before on the earth or will ever be seen again. The note that strikes for us is the abomination of desolation, standing where it should not be. A number of things that are important about this statement. The first is this, that the word abomination denoted pagan idolatry and its detestable practices. Whenever you look to the Old Testament, you find this reference to that which is an abomination. It was the desecration. Ezekiel is going to deal with it in chapter 8, as he's going to be shown the desecration, the detestable occurrences that happened in the temple, and the judgment that was going to come. Eventually God's glory was going to depart from the temple because of these detestable things, but it was the amalgamation or the mixing in of all of the pagan stuff and the pagan worship and the deities and so on, and bringing them into the temple, therefore defiling the temple, leading God to depart from it and to depart from it with His glory. The phrase of the abomination of desolation referred to the presence of an idolatrous person or an object so detestable that it caused the temple to be abandoned and left desolate. And again, this is why God's glory left the temple, not to return again until the millennial kingdom. So basically then the phrasing, the first thing we need to understand about this statement about the abomination is that we're talking not about the destruction of the temple, but its profaning of it. This is something totally different than what happened with Titus. And there are many who try to weave that in here, but it just is not present here. This is something that has never happened before. And so when we look at this, it's interesting because he makes a statement about the abomination of desolation. It takes our mind back to Daniel's prophecy. But in 1 Maccabees, if you read in Maccabees chapter 1, verse 54, an abomination of desolation, this was used of a previous event. This was used in the first historical fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies. In chapter 11, verses 31 through 32, he is going to lay out for us what was going to happen. And this happened in 167 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes came and he desecrated the temple. As he came, he erected an altar of the pagan Greek god Zeus over the altar of burnt offering, and he sacrificed a pig on it. Then the Syrians came in on December 15th of 167 BC, and they imposed an idol statue of the same god in the same temple. They also spread the pig's broth all over to defile the temple and its objects that were set aside and dedicated to God. But this foreshadows another prophecy that Daniel is going to give in chapter 9 of the Antichrist and what he is going to do when he comes to the temple in the second part of the tribulation. So there is a partial fulfillment of foreshadowing in the time of in between this and this before the coming of Christ in 167 BC. Before the coming of Christ, we have this fulfillment of Daniel 11. Then we have the future being looked on, and the Antichrist is going to come later in the tribulation, and that is in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. On top of this statement that links this with the prophecies of Daniel, we have this reference, standing where it should not be. Now, this is interesting phrasing because in the English you don't really see it, but in the Greek it is this. He used a masculine participle. The word standing here is a masculine participle and is modifying the neuter noun abomination, which would indicate that the abomination should be regarded as personal. In other words, I think that when Mark is recording the words of Christ as Christ is teaching the disciples, he is looking at the personal end-time Antichrist as he talks about the one standing where he should not be. Following me so far? So I think that already with these two notations, we're looking at something beyond what has already been historically fulfilled before the time of Christ, what was historically fulfilled after Christ's prophecy in the early part of chapter 13. It's looking to the eschaton. It is looking to the end times. We know from Daniel that the Antichrist will come and he will make a covenant with the Jewish people, beginning the 7-year period preceding Christ's second coming in chapter 9, verse 27. We know that the temple then is going to be rebuilt and worship is going to be reestablished, but in the middle of this period, in the middle of the tribulation, after the first 3.5 years, he is going to break that covenant and he is going to stop the temple sacrifices and he is going to desecrate the temple. And this is what I believe that he is referring to in chapter 13, verse 14, as he talks about the abomination of desolation and the one standing where he ought not to stand. Those who refuse to identify with the Antichrist will suffer severe persecution and be forced to flee in refuge, but there will be those who will be saved during this period. And I believe that is the reference to those who have been chosen, or the chosen ones, in verse 20 and also in verse 27, that there will be those who will be saved in the time of tribulation. This crisis is going to be so severe that we have the response given, as Jesus says in the end of verse 14 and following. He says, "Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one who is on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house. And the one who is in the field must not turn back to get his coat. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, but pray that it may not happen in the winter." Jesus' first instruction is that they will flee to the mountains. And it's interesting, this term flee in Greek, the triliteral root is fug, which is where we get our word fugitive from, and that is what they become. They are fugitives running and escaping from the danger that they are going to face. Jesus warns that those who live in Judea will escape the Holocaust and will take refuge in the mountains. And the urgency of the situation is clearly seen in the description that comes in the verses that follow, and the prayer, the petition, that it may not happen during the winter time. In other words, that it may not be a time of severity for those women who are pregnant or those who are nursing, because this will be a difficult time. But this will not be the worst of it. The reason for this kind of response, then, the urgency for fleeing as they do, as Christ indicates in these verses, is given in verse 19. The word "for" gives us the reason. "For those days will be a time of tribulation, so this has not occurred since the beginning of the creation which God created until now, and never will." The reason for the urgency in the unhindered flight is seen in the words "tribulation such as has not occurred." I mean, just stop and dwell on the powerful words that Christ is speaking here. This tribulation is unequaled from the beginning of creation until now, and it will never be equaled ever again. In other words, there is nothing that is going to be compared to this time that is going to take place. And the redundancy that he uses here to reflect the fullness and the urgency of it, the stresses, the fierceness of what's going to take place. There is no way that these descriptions indicate what happened in AD 70 when Titus came and destroyed Jerusalem. This is something far greater, far more severe. At no time in the past, present, or future has there been or will there ever be such a severe tribulation as this one. And I pray that my theology is correct and we will not be here as the church, because this is not going to be a joyful time, but a joyful time will come at the end. This proclamation is much too emphatic for merely a siege. This tribulation is the great one that's referred to in Revelation. And not only that, but notice verse 20. "Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh," literally, "no flesh would have been saved. For the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days." Now just think on this for a moment. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would have been saved. The thing that we're immediately reminded of the fact is that the Lord is in control of all of human history. He is in sovereign control of everything. He has decreed what is going to take place. He has decreed the limitation of these days, and notice the reason for it. It is for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, literally middle voice, for himself. In other words, if he were to allow it to be carried out to its end, all of human flesh would be completely destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. This is not AD 70. This is something far greater than that. This statement, "had shortened," is an aorist tense, and we notice then already something significant about it. Had shortened. It's looking at what? It's past tense. Not only that, but read on. "No life would have been saved." Well, why does he put it in the past tense if it's the future? Because it is so sure it is going to happen, it can be spoken of as already taking place. But not only that, it shows the fact that God has already decreed it, and he intensifies this statement here, had shortened. And it's unfortunate how it's translated. Literally, it's amputated or mutilated. That's the term that he uses here. Now think about this. If he had not amputated the days or mutilated the days, why such a powerful figure of speech? Is because he wants to show how forcefully God has acted and is going to act in the permission of these things, but he is going to bring it to an end. He's not going to let them extend to the full. He's going to cut them off. Because if he had not, and he does not, then no flesh would exist. This reference to no flesh indicates the human life and its frailty and infirmity, and God has curtailed the period to prevent the destruction of the human race. This is not AD 70. This is the tribulation, the great one. All of this is necessary because of the coming of Christ in chapter 13, verses 24 and following. All of these things are going to take place, but the amazing thing is that when Christ comes and he establishes his kingdom here on earth, and he has the millennial reign upon the earth, there's going to be peace, there's going to be blessing, things are going to flourish, but all of this stuff is going to take place before that. The exhortation then that comes in light of this, he says in verses 21 and following, and then if anyone says to you, now clearly when he refers to you, he is talking about believers. If anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, here is there, do not believe him, for the false Christ and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. It's interesting that back in chapter 4, when Jesus Christ was giving the parables of the kingdom, the key word that ran all the way through there was hear, 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 or listen, listen, listen. When we come to chapter 13, we find that the repeated term that runs through here is beware, beware. Be awake, be attentive to what is happening. We need to know that these events are going to take place, but we are not to be like that gentleman in San Francisco who predicted the hour and the day and put up billboards all over the place and pilfered all kinds of people's money because he was predicting that he could tell when the Lord was going to come. Unfortunately, he didn't read later in chapter 13 where Jesus says no one knows the hour nor the day. We're not supposed to flee to the hills. We're not supposed to be terrified. We need to be aware of what is happening, but we need to understand that we have a task, and that task is to preach the gospel to the nations. That is the sole reason why we are here. In the interim, this is what we must be doing. The problem is that we have gotten so used to living in the interval. We've gotten so used to not living with eschatological mindsets. We got so used to the idea that He's going to come far down the line, not in our lifetime, not in our kids' lifetime, not in my grandkids' lifetime. We have so lulled ourselves into that position of thinking that that is what is going to happen, but we don't know. We don't know. And we must be living as it is the last days, because it is the last days. And as 1 John said, it is the last day. The challenge for all of us is we need to wake up. We need to wake up. And we need to be about the business that we are to be about. I leave with you 2 Peter. If you turn with me to 2 Peter, and I'll finish with this. 2 Peter chapter 3. Peter writes this in verse 3 of chapter 3, "Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, 'Where is the promise of His coming?' For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, and through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. But by His word the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction on ungodly men. But do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like 1 day. The Lord is not slow about His promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. Since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because which the heavens will be destroyed by burning, and the elements will be melted with intense heat. But according to His promise, we are looking for new heavens and new earth, in which righteousness dwells. Our problem is not being over eschatological in our view of life. Our problem is being under eschatological. We are in the last days. It is the last day. And my prayer is that we will begin to live like it. That we would be aware, that we would be awake, that we would be looking and hastening the day of our Lord's return. And while we are waiting, we are busy working. That we are proclaiming the gospel to the ends of the earth. I think about that song that we sing, will Jesus find us watching? Yes, will He find us watching? Or will He find us being just about business, acting as though He is never going to come? May God help us. Dad, would you close in a word of prayer, please?